Welcome back to our channel, where we peel back the polished layers of the British monarchy to reveal the cold, hard truths hidden behind the palace gates. What you are witnessing right now is not just a routine royal update. You are watching a 1,000-year-old system finally reach its breaking point. For months, the world was fed a carefully curated narrative of privacy and planned recovery. But the shocking truth behind the palace's silence has finally been exposed. At the center of this storm stands Prince William, an heir who has finally chosen a defiant stand over the rigid, often heartless protocols of the institution he is set to inherit. Think about the atmosphere within those stone walls. For months, Princess Kate was missing from public life. And every time the public asked basic questions, the palace machine replied with the same hollow script: privacy, space, recovery. But silence in a family is one thing. Silence in a public institution is another entirely. They didn't just manage the optics. They tried to control reality itself. Imagine a grand old house with deep cracks in the walls. You don't fix it by hanging more beautiful paintings. You have to look directly at the damage. For too long, the palace tried to hide those cracks, using privacy as a shield to delay a truth that was becoming increasingly impossible to contain. This wasn't transparency. It was truth dragged out at the last possible moment. Prince William watched as his wife was subjected to a global whirlwind of conspiracy theories, fueled by the palace's own lack of transparency and a series of disastrously managed public relations moves, including faked photos that only deepened the crisis of trust. The heir to the throne found himself in a brutal conflict with advisors who prioritized image stability over the human reality of a family in crisis. Tonight, we are diving into the moment William decided he had seen enough. The moment he decided that the woman who holds the emotional center of this monarchy deserved more than a cold, institutional silence. This is the night the palace mask finally slipped, and the future king was forced to admit that even the crown can bleed. You don't keep canceling a future king's schedule for nothing. For months, the silence surrounding Princess Kate was not just an absence of news. It was a loud, vibrating shadow that stretched across the halls of Buckingham Palace. The official narrative began with a planned and successful surgery. Yet, as weeks turned into months, the world watched as a vacuum of information was filled with the darkest of doubts. This wasn't an accident of timing. It was a strategic choice by an ancient institution that still believes silence is a form of control. But in the 21st century, silence doesn't command respect. It breeds suspicion. While the palace machine repeated the same tired lines, Prince William was living a reality that the cameras were never allowed to see. Imagine the strain on a man caught between his duty to a 1,000-year-old protocol and his devotion to a wife fighting for her life. Behind those gates, the gears of the monarchy were grinding, and the internal tension was reaching a fever pitch. We saw the signs, even if the palace refused to admit them. When William abruptly canceled his attendance at a major memorial service for a godfather he respected, citing personal reasons, the mask of business as usual didn't just slip, it shattered. You could see it in his eyes, the subtle signs of a man under a weight no one should carry alone. In the world of royal crisis analysis, we look at more than just the statements. We look at the human map of the story. The external signs of exhaustion, the forced smiles during brief public appearances, and the hollow ring of the official updates were the physical manifestations of a system in panic management. This was a monarchy forced to admit it is mortal, yet still terrified of showing its scars. William stood at a crossroads. Continue the charade of everything is fine, or break the cycle of secrecy that his own mother, Princess Diana, once challenged so bravely. The shadow of doubt was no longer just about a medical chart. It was about whether the monarchy could survive a world that saw its humanity and its fragility in real time. If a future king has to overrule his entire court just to tell the truth, we aren't just looking at a health update, we are looking at a constitutional crisis disguised as a family drama. Behind the heavy, ancient oak doors of the palace, a war of words was brewing that no amount of royal polish could hide. This wasn't just a disagreement over scheduling or press releases. It was a fundamental battle for the soul of the modern monarchy. While official spokespeople were busy crafting their no-comment responses, the cracks in the palace's armor were beginning to show. Leaks were starting to seep out from the edges of the medical corridors, whispers of unexpected complications, and a longer road to recovery than anyone was willing to admit out loud. For Prince William, the real fight wasn't against the tabloids. It was against a palace machine that has spent centuries perfecting the art of burying human vulnerability under layers of rigid protocol. Inside the household, the tension was reportedly electric. Sources close to the inner circle describe heated debates between William and the veteran courtiers, the men in gray suits, who have long managed the crown's image. These advisors argued that any admission of weakness, any deviation from the never complain, never explain mantra, would be a surrender to the vultures. They wanted to maintain the mask of institutional invulnerability at all costs. But William, having watched his mother suffer under that same weight, saw the human cost. He saw his wife being treated as a strategic asset to be managed, rather than a woman fighting a deeply personal battle. The breaking point reportedly came with an internal communication that stripped away the last of the palace's pretenses. An email began to circulate among the top-tier staff with a subject line that cut through the institutional coldness. She deserves more than silence. It was a desperate, defiant plea for basic human decency over bureaucratic control. This was the moment the mask wasn't just slipping, it was being torn off. William realized that by clinging to a script of secrecy, the palace wasn't protecting Kate, it was feeding her to the rumors. He was forced to confront a terrifying reality. The machine he was born to lead was failing the person he loved most, and the only way to save her was to break the rules of the crown. If the previous chapters of this saga were about the internal war, this moment is about when that war spilled into the global arena, leaving the palace with nowhere left to hide. Every crisis has a tipping point, a single moment where the narrative collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. For the British monarchy, that moment arrived on Mother's Day. What was supposed to be a heartwarming image of Princess Kate and her children, a visual peace offering to quiet the rumors, became the very thing that set the world on fire. When global news agencies issued an unprecedented kill notice on that photo, they weren't just rejecting a digital file. They were rejecting the palace's fundamental credibility. For the first time in history, the institution was officially flagged by the global press for manipulating the truth in the digital age. Imagine the suffocating atmosphere in the private quarters of Adelaide Cottage when that news broke. Prince William, who had reportedly been involved in the conceptualization of the photo to protect his family's normalcy, saw his attempt backfire in the most public and humiliating way possible. This wasn't just a bad edit, it was a digital fingerprint of a palace in a state of absolute panic. The kill notice sent a clear, chilling message to the world. We no longer trust what you tell us. This was the shocking truth behind the long silence. The realization that the palace machine had become so desperate to control the image of a healthy Kate that they had forgotten how to be honest. The silence hadn't been a shield, it had been a pressure cooker, and it had just exploded in front of billions. In the analytical world of power dynamics, this was more than a PR blunder. It was a catastrophe. When the lens cracked, so did the public's faith in the future king and queen. For William, this was a personal humiliation that cut deep. He realized that the men in gray suits and the rigid, archaic protocols had led them into a dead end. The defiant stand he took in the aftermath wasn't just about a corrected press release. It was about a fundamental, tectonic shift in strategy. He saw that you cannot fight digital-age conspiracy theories with Victorian-age secrecy. The world didn't want a perfect, edited version of reality. They wanted the raw, unvarnished truth. The Mother's Day disaster proved that the palace's silence was no longer a sustainable option. It was time for a new, more dangerous kind of honesty. And William knew he had to be the one to lead the way, even if it meant breaking every sacred rule his ancestors had lived by for centuries. The fallout from the Mother's Day photo scandal, often referred to in media circles as the lens-cracked moment, was the final nail in the coffin for the old way of doing things. For Prince William, This was a moment of profound and painful clarity. He saw, with brutal certainty, that the institution was attempting to protect a version of reality that simply no longer existed. The shocking truth that began to emerge wasn't just about a medical diagnosis. It was about the fundamental, structural inability of the palace machine to handle a human crisis in a transparent, digital world. This is where William's defiant stand truly shifts from a private disagreement to a public revolution. He stopped being the compliant heir and started being the fiercely protective husband, standing as a human shield between his wife and the very system he was born to lead. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere within the royal household was described by insiders as a state of civil war. William reportedly demanded a complete and immediate overhaul of the communication strategy. He was no longer willing to let Kate be the scapegoat for the palace's editing failures or their persistent lack of transparency. The silence had to end, but William insisted it had to end on their terms, not the institution's. This was a direct, unprecedented challenge to the authority of the men in gray suits who had managed royal narratives for decades. William was essentially drawing a line in the sand, declaring that his family's humanity came first, and the crown's image came second. For a man who has spent his entire life living by the rigid royal rulebook, this was a revolutionary act of defiance. He realized that every single day of silence was another day Kate was being hunted by the darker corners of the internet. The shocking reality exposed was that the palace's archaic protocols were actually endangering the princess's mental well-being and her physical recovery. William decided to bypass the traditional filtered press office entirely. He wanted a direct, unedited line to the public, free from the clinical coldness of official statements. This defiance wasn't just a calculated PR move, it was a survival tactic. He was fighting for Kate's right to tell her own story, in her own voice, and in her own time. This was the moment the future king chose to be a man first and a monarch second, setting the stage for a revelation that would not only shock the world, but change the face of the British monarchy forever. The strategic retreat into the quiet, sun-dappled corridors of Adelaide Cottage was not an act of hiding, it was the fortification of a sanctuary. As Prince William moved through these private spaces, the shocking truth that had been whispered in hushed medical consultations began to reshape the very air he breathed. This was no longer about a constitutional role, a military patron, or the next high-profile royal engagement. This was about the fragile, human reality of a mother, a wife, and a future queen, facing a battle that no amount of royal wealth or ancient power could solve for her. The silence of the palace had reached its ultimate limit because the truth had become too heavy for the institution's cold, bureaucratic shoulders to carry anymore. William's defiant stand evolved here, in the quiet moments away from the relentless flashbulbs, as he looked at the woman who has been the monarchy's greatest asset and realized she was now its most vulnerable heart. The palace machine, ever the relic of a bygone era, wanted a press release, a cold, typed document on heavy ivory letterhead that would check a box and satisfy a single news cycle. But William, fueled by a mixture of protective rage and profound, quiet grief, reportedly rejected every draft. He saw the failed perception management of the past weeks for what it truly was, a betrayal of Kate's dignity. While the men in gray suits were still playing a calculated game of chess, worried about the impact on the brand and the stability of the institution, William was looking at the woman he loved. This defiance was about reclaiming the narrative from those who viewed her as a strategic asset to be managed, rather than a human being in pain. He understood with startling clarity that if the palace told the story, it would be a clinical medical update. But if Kate told the story, it would be a profound human connection. This distinction was the fundamental, tectonic break from 1,000 years of royal history. As the world outside continued to spin in a feverish, often cruel whirlwind of conspiracy, William was orchestrating a countermove that would bypass the filters of the palace press office entirely. He was preparing to let the world in, but only far enough to see the humanity, not to consume the soul. The shocking truth behind the silence was that they were deeply afraid, not just of the illness itself, but of the machine's inherent inability to handle it with grace or compassion. William's stance became a human shield, blocking the institutional pressure that demanded a return-to-work date. He was prioritizing the remission and mental peace of his wife over the relevance of the monarchy in the Sunday papers. It was a brutal, beautiful decision that signaled the end of the old guard, and the birth of a monarchy that finally understood a vital secret. To lead a modern people, you must first show them that you are one of them. The stage was being set for a revelation that would leave the world breathless, and the palace machine forever changed. The transition from the fortified silence of Adelaide Cottage to the world-shattering revelation was not a sudden leak, but a slow, agonizing realization that the old world was dead. Prince William, standing in the crosshairs of history, understood that the shocking truth behind the palace's silence had created a monster of speculation that was now threatening to devour his family's peace. The internal civil war had reached its conclusion, and William had emerged not just as an heir, but as a revolutionary. He looked at the medical reports, the social media vitriol, and the tired eyes of his wife, and he made the call that would haunt and heal the monarchy simultaneously. The defiance was no longer about keeping the world out. It was about letting them in on his family's own terms, stripping away the ivory towers and the royal velvet to reveal the raw, trembling humanity beneath. The palace machine had suggested a formal televised address, a grand setting with flags, medals, and the weight of the institution providing a stoic backdrop. They wanted the future queen to speak as a symbol of resilience, but William reportedly intervened with a finality that silenced the room. He insisted on the bench. He insisted on the garden. He insisted on the ordinary. This was his most defiant stand yet, the rejection of royal stagecraft in favor of human connection. The shocking truth exposed in this moment was that the monarchy's survival didn't depend on its perceived perfection, but on its shared vulnerability. William was orchestrating a human reset, realizing that for Kate to be saved from the rumors, she had to be seen not as an icon, but as a mother and a patient. This was the moment he realized that the palace silence had been a prison, and the truth was the only key. As the cameras were quietly brought into the private grounds, William stayed just out of frame, a silent guardian of the narrative he had fought so hard to reclaim. The shocking reality that the palace had tried to hide, that cancer had touched the very heart of the succession, was about to become a global shared experience. William's defiance had led them to this garden bench, a place of ordinary beauty for an extraordinary confession. He had bypassed the men in gray suits and their clinical press releases to allow Kate to speak directly to the souls of the people. This wasn't a PR victory, it was a moral stand. By allowing the silence to be broken by Kate's own voice, William was proving that the modern monarchy could only exist if it stopped lying to itself about its own fragility. The air was thick with the weight of what was about to be said, a moment that would prove that the shocking truth behind the silence was far more relatable and far more tragic than any conspiracy could ever imagine. The silence did not just break, it shattered. When the world finally saw the future queen sitting alone on that simple wooden bench, surrounded by the ordinary greenery of a spring garden, the shocking truth behind the palace's months of secrecy was laid bare in its most tragic and human form. This was the moment Prince William's defiant stand reached its most visible and gut-wrenching manifestation. By allowing Kate to speak directly to the camera, stripped of royal finery and the clinical distance of a press release, he was essentially burning the old royal rulebook in front of a global audience. The palace machine had spent decades perfecting the art of never complain, never explain. But William realized that in the face of cancer, that mantra was not a shield, it was a shroud. He chose a path of radical, painful honesty, forcing the institution to confront the reality that even its most luminous stars are bound by the same fragile biology as the people they serve. The setting itself, a garden bench rather than a gilded throne room, was a silent scream of defiance against the men in gray suits. While the traditional courtiers had pushed for a more formal, institutional address to maintain the illusion of invulnerability, William had pushed for the raw and the relatable. He understood that the public's anger over the Mother's Day photo and the palace silence could only be healed by a profound display of vulnerability. The shocking reality that the future of the monarchy was now intertwined with a grueling medical recovery changed the power dynamics of the crown overnight. William stood in the wings, not as a decorative heir, but as a man who had successfully wrestled the narrative away from a cold, bureaucratic system. He had gambled the reputation of the monarchy on the power of the truth, and as the world wept with Kate, it became clear that the gamble had paid off. The silence had been replaced by a deep, communal empathy. This moment marked the beginning of what we now call the Great Reset. The shocking truth didn't just reveal an illness, it revealed a new way of being royal. William's stance ensured that the palace could no longer hide behind privacy when it was actually practicing evasion. He had redefined the boundaries between the public's right to know and a family's right to heal. As the news cycle shifted from speculation to support, the internal architects of the palace's silence were forced to admit that their archaic methods had nearly destroyed the very family they were sworn to protect. William had proven that a king's greatest strength isn't his crown, but his ability to stand in the truth, no matter how terrifying that truth might be. The monarchy was no longer just a distant, polished brand. It had become a family that the world finally, truly understood. The global ripple effect of that garden bench revelation was nothing short of a seismic shift in the history of the British monarchy. It was the moment the Great Reset moved from a private household strategy into a worldwide reality. The shocking truth behind the palace's silence had finally been replaced by a narrative of profound, shared humanity, and the response was an overwhelming tidal wave of empathy that effectively silenced the vultures of speculation. For Prince William, this was the ultimate validation of his defiant stand. He had proven that the modern world does not demand perfection from its leaders. It demands presence. It demands the courage to say, "We are hurting, and we are human." The palace machine, which had spent centuries perfecting the art of the untouchable icon, was forced to sit in the quiet aftermath and realize that their greatest strength was not the crown's invulnerability, but the family's vulnerability. Behind the scenes, the men in gray suits were reportedly in a state of total strategic review. The old guard had been silenced by the sheer power of the public's connection to Kate's raw honesty. William had essentially conducted a masterclass in modern crisis management by doing the one thing the institution feared most: letting go of control. This was a brutal realization for the bureaucratic architects of the previous month's secrecy. They saw that their clinical press releases and planned recovery scripts had almost cost the monarchy its soul. William's influence was now absolute. He had established a new moral standard for the household, one where the mental and physical well-being of the family would never again be sacrificed at the altar of institutional optics. The shocking truth exposed was that the monarchy had been dying behind its own walls of silence, and it took a life-threatening crisis to bring it back to life. As the word remission began to enter the royal lexicon in the months that followed, it became a metaphor for the monarchy itself. The institution was in a state of recovery, learning how to breathe in a new atmosphere of transparency. William's defiant stand had successfully pivoted the crown from a distant, archaic relic into a relatable, modern family that understood the struggles of its people because they were living them. The digital battlefield, once filled with poison, was now a space of communal support. This was the lasting impact of William's rebellion. He had saved the monarchy not by making it stronger, but by allowing it to be seen as it truly was: fragile, determined, and deeply connected. The silence was gone, replaced by a new, more honest dialogue that suggested the future king would not be a man of secrets, but a man of truth. The world was no longer looking for a fairy tale. They were looking for a leader who knew the value of a garden bench and the power of an unvarnished voice. The story of the garden bench and the shattering of the palace's silence is more than just a historical footnote in the British monarchy. It is the definitive blueprint for its survival in the modern age. As we reach the conclusion of this dramatic saga, we see Prince William standing not just as a future king, but as the primary architect of a new, human-centric, vaster kingdom. The defiant stand he took was never about rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was a desperate, calculated, and ultimately heroic act to save the woman he loved from being crushed by the very institution that was supposed to protect her. The shocking truth that was exposed throughout these months, from the health scares to the media disasters, forced a tectonic shift in how power is exercised behind those ancient stone walls. William proved that the crown's greatest weapon in the 21st century is not a military title or a billion-pound estate, but the simple, unvarnished truth. Looking ahead, the monarchy that emerges from this crisis is fundamentally different from the one that entered it. The institutional rot of secrecy and failed perception management has been cut away, replaced by a mandate of transparency that William has etched into the royal soul. The silence is no longer a viable tool of the state. Every future crisis will now be measured against the garden bench standard. Was it honest? Was it human? Was it timely? By choosing Kate's peace over the palace's protocols, William didn't just protect his wife. He earned a new kind of moral authority that no crown could ever bestow. He is no longer seen as a cold, distant heir, but as a leader who understands the weight of human suffering and the power of communal empathy. The remission of the monarchy is complete, but the scars remain as a permanent reminder that even a 1,000-year-old institution must evolve or fade into irrelevance. As we close this narrative, we are left with a powerful image of a monarchy that has finally stopped running from its own reflection. The shocking truth behind the silence was that the palace was afraid of the people's judgment. But through William's defiance, they discovered that the people's compassion is far stronger than their criticism. This is the legacy of the current crisis. A monarchy that is no longer a distant fairy tale, but a relatable human story. William has set the stage for a reign defined by reality, not mystery. Thank you for following this deep dive analysis into the heart of the British monarchy. The mask has dropped, the truth is out, and for the first time in generations, the palace is finally speaking the same language as the world outside.